Okay, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is David Gottfried. I'm the director of the National Nanotechnology Coordinated Infrastructure Coordinating Office located at Georgia Tech. Welcome to another NNCI webinar, this time focusing on issues in societal and ethical implications. This will be our last webinar before we take a summer hiatus, and we will be back actually in the heat of summer in August with our next webinar, and details will be posted about that soon. If you have missed past webinars and want to view the videos, or if you want to see information about upcoming webinars, you can go to our events page on the NNCI website, and you can again view recordings of past webinars on our YouTube channel, and I'll post links to both of those in the chat in a moment. If you have questions for our panelists, and I'm going to pass it off to our moderator in a minute, but if you do have questions for the panel, then please put them into the Q&A portion of Zoom, which you can find at the bottom of your page. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Jamie Wetmore from Arizona State University, who will be moderating today's discussion.
Thanks, David. We are excited to be here, and we thank you for the opportunity. I'm really excited because I get to hang out with some old friends. So today we are bringing together 4 alums from the NNCI Science Outside the Lab program, formerly graduate students at NNCI universities that decided a career in policy, or at least a brief foray into policy was an exciting way to move their career. And we get to learn from their experiences and what they've been up to. All 4 of these people headed off and at least spent some time working in state governments, state legislatures, and other parts of state governments. And we are going to have 4. We have one person who is going to figure out the email shortly and join us. We're looking forward to that. I will just give really quick intros, and then maybe we can have each of you give like a 1-minute introduction of where you've come from and where you are now. So we'll start. Mariah, do you want to start us off?
Sure thing. My name is Mariah Locklear. I work for Arizona State now in the Federal Research Engagement Office. Prior to that, I was at a science and technology policy think tank after I finished my graduate work at University of Nebraska-Lincoln in chemistry. I worked in the state legislature as an intern in the from 2018 through 2020. Is that enough?
That sounds perfect.
Okay.
Sawyer, you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Sawyer Morgan, and I did my PhD in chemical engineering at the University of Washington, and I attended Science Outside the Lab in 2018. That helped inspire me to apply for the Eagleton Science and Politics Fellowship, which placed me at the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities in 2021. So I spent a year there as a fellow, and I've continued there as a full employee now, working on design and implementation of solar incentive programs, including the Community Solar Program.
And Sawyer, you preempted me with my gotcha question. You remembered which year you had done Science Outside the Lab. I'm impressed. All right, Stephanie.
I'm so sorry, I could not get my headphones to connect, so I suspect the background noise is a lot. But hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Mitchell. I recently finished my PhD in chemical biology from the University of Minnesota. I was also trying to sneaky Google in my resume when I also did Science Outside the Lab. I would guess maybe 2017 then, because I don't think I've ever met you before, Sawyer, excuse me. I am currently a CCST Science Fellow, a California Council on Science and Technology Science Fellow, and I am placed in the Assembly Committee on Water, Parks, and Wildlife, so things that are related to water, state or local parks, and wildlife. So I am currently on a beaver exploration right now with the chair of my committee, which is why I am not in the office right
now. Thanks, Stephanie. I could hear you just fine, so I think it worked very well. And you are the first participant ever in a solo program that is off on a beaver study. So I'm impressed. All right, Jacob, thanks for thanks for figuring this out. We got you here. The floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. I got my PhD in biochemistry at the University of Washington, and I did science outside the lab, I think, in 2019. Had a great time. And when I graduated, I applied to the California Council on Science and Technology's Policy Fellowship Program, same as Stephanie. And I was a fellow last year in the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, and now I'm working as an assistant consultant in the Senate Transportation Committee.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to ask some general questions of our panel. If people have questions along the way, feel free to post them, and we'll try to leave some room and time for questions at the end. So let me just start by saying one of the reasons we pulled you all together is that you guys are all working at the state level, and you're all across the country, so not easy to gather you in DC. I think when we started the Science Outside the Lab program, there were not any states that ran an S&T fellowship program. These are all pretty new, and states, I think, are increasingly realizing the experience and the understandings that all of you bring to the job is really, really important. But I want to start with sort of a broader general question, which is, you were all, I think everybody here was all lab scientists. You guys spent countless hours in dark rooms, in sometimes officially wearing your lab coat, maybe not always. And then you all decided maybe you wanted to do something different. So I'm just curious if anybody wants to sort of, why science policy? What is it about science policy or the types of job that you're working in now that really drew you to decide to do something different than what your official PhD training was in?
This was not on the list of prepared questions, Jamie, but I'm happy to answer it. I wanted to do broader impacts. I was doing synthetic organic chemistry and I enjoyed it. I did not love the risk of blowing myself up every day. But other than that, I wanted to live in DC for a long time. I think the opportunity to use your scientific background to help people that do not have a scientific background, but so they can help people, the general public. I think that's really exciting. And now in my new role at Arizona State University, I get to help faculty work with the federal government on a large scale.
For me, it was kind of a mix of just events that happened during grad school, getting me more interested in the policy world. In particular, our labor union went on strike in 2018, and being a part of that was kind of eye-opening, seeing about how there's a very firm interaction between policy and science and how the work of science is done. Got me interested in kind of that sphere. And then during my PhD, I loved research. I still like it. Like I could see another life where I went out and became a professor or a research scientist or something. But you become pigeonholed, right? You become a specialist in one very narrow field and use one set of skills over and over again and really perfect them. And that's great, but I found it a little bit stifling. My undergrad was at a liberal arts institution. I kind of missed talking to people who weren't scientists and kind of using different parts of my brain that you don't necessarily always use or aren't rewarded for using as a scientist. And policy seemed like a great place to use both the analytical skills and kind of research skills I developed in my PhD, but also the communication skills and the organizing and other types of work that I enjoy doing as part of my career.
I always had a strong interest in politics and policy. I did a minor in political science in undergrad and was involved in a number of political campaigns in undergrad and continued in graduate school. And although I really enjoyed my research as well, I found that it got fairly repetitive and I couldn't quite see the broader impacts of that. And I wanted to get involved in a different area that would allow me to have more real world direct impacts and decision making that can have a direct relationship with what we're doing to combat climate change. And coming to a utility regulator has really enabled me to do that more than I feel like my research background or my graduate school research allowed me to do in that sense. And so moving to an area that allows me to work with different stakeholders has been very interesting and a useful transition for me to having worked with other people during graduate school and meeting with people who had done science fellowships and made this transition.
Yeah, and I think I recognize a lot of everybody's stories in mine as well. There's just, yeah, a lot of reasons I think people end up wanting to go into policy. I think for me, one of the clearest kind of transitions was part of my research. So I did research as a part of this like big consortium of other universities that had a mission statement, and at the end of the mission statement said, for societal benefit. And I was really interested in kind of, okay, well, how do we actually take action on that for societal benefit portion? And I started getting involved in a lot of science outreach and communication. And eventually that led me to a point where I'm in a farmer's market talking about my research, and I don't really know what my punchline is. Like, so what am I going to tell people to do practically about this problem? And it was kind of tricky too, because like being a scientist, I was like, I'm not actually sure I'm qualified to tell you what to do. I know about this narrow portion of science, but there's so much other stuff. And so I kind of was like frozen with my own knowledge. Like the more you learn, the less you know, and to tell people how to actually make action based on that. Because it's not just science, it's societal and economic and practical even. And so I really wanted to explore that more. And kind of sit in a place of conflict over science, even like science says one thing, but a lot of other things maybe pull you in a different way. How do you make decisions based on that? And so, yeah, that's kind of what inspired me to move into the policy space.
All right, well, you all did very well with the question I didn't pre-plan for you. So I'll go back to script. When I think about sort of science policy and the kinds of questions that are asked in that, I usually think about the federal government. I think about the EPA. I think about the Department of Transportation. I think of NOAA. But you guys all did work at the state level. So what drew you all to sort of state government? What is maybe different or special, or give us some sense of the kinds of questions that your expertise is really useful for at a state level?
I can start again. I would say panic. I went on Science Outside the Lab, and in 2018, I do remember which year I was there. And it was just really eye-opening to the competitive landscape that is entering science policy, entering the world that isn't chemistry in my case. And I remember laying in the dorm rooms, which all the Science Outside the Lab kids can remember or will know, just frantically using my phone to look for Democrats in the Nebraska state legislature, because I wanted to be as competitive as possible for my future career. And I did that because a PhD isn't enough. And that's like the worst phrase I think you can ever say to someone, but having simply a piece of paper is not prepare you for any career. I don't think, definitely not one in science policy, where the skill set comes from fundamentals you gather in your PhD, but those need real life and practical experience. And I was a senator named Carol Blood, who actually ran for Nebraska governor, was gracious enough to let me be in her office. So that was how I ended up in the only unicameral legislature in the country, as well as one of the tallest, I think we're number 5 tallest, Capitol building.
I was looking at the science policy fellowships that looked at the federal fellowship, as well as the CCST in California that Stephanie and Jacob have done. And then I found out about the Eagleton Fellowship in New Jersey, and I applied and was able to get in here. And I really like that we're a fairly small agency, and it's a tight-knit government in a way that we're able to be a bit more on the ground and focusing on the direct aspects and direct applications of what we're regulating and working on. At the federal level, it's coming from a much higher picture that a lot of what some of the federal agencies do are working with more local agencies and providing grants or providing frameworks for their programs, but being able to work specifically on these programs, and then with that, working with local stakeholders and seeing what's actually happening on the ground has been really interesting and informative to me. And so with that, I can more directly have an impact and relationship with others, be able to bring my scientific experience and bring that research-based outlook to what we're doing as one of the very few science people with a science background in the agency.
Then I guess Jacob and I maybe can tag team the CCST experience. And yeah, I was also kind of looking for something at the state level. So I looked at all of these different kind of state offerings for policy fellowships, and California, between being something not in the Midwest, and I was really looking to kind of move out of the Midwest for a little bit of part of my life, was really attractive, but also the scale. I mean, California is an incredibly large state with a very active economy. People famously here love to talk about how it's the 4th or 5th biggest economy in the world. And also the legislature is incredibly active. So being able to be a part of that and actually learn and be able to follow bills from beginning to end was going to be an incredible experience, because the CCST program puts fellows in both the legislature and in executive positions. And there are pathways for PhDs to enter these executive roles, but the opportunity to work in the legislature is truly unique and not something that has really a clear pipeline from the bench to the legislature. So my PhD, because of that, is a little bit more of a talking point than it is my research is actually applicable to the work I'm doing now. But of course, that kind of thought process and independent thinking and way to analyze arguments that you do in your PhD are, of course, super beneficial.
Yeah, it's a very similar story to everyone else. You know, I was looking at what policy options were out there. These fellowships are very attractive, like well set up paths for getting from science to policy, but they're not the only path out there, but they're the obvious one. So when I was looking, the state fellowships really appealed to me. During my PhD work, it was, you know, very cool, but very abstract. I did protein design, working with computer models and like the shape of proteins that you'll never actually see with your eyes. It's all kind of imaginary, although physically real and very important. One of the exciting things about policy was actually getting to make changes that I can, you know, see and have impact on people's lives in a more direct way. And I think you get a little bit more of that at the state level, being a little bit close to the ground. You can relate, or at least I find it easier to relate with the groups that come to talk to me about various ideas and to potentially go out to field visits and see sites where things are happening. So that was very appealing to me. Also, stuff kind of moves, at least in California, but I think is true generally at most state legislatures and government bodies, moves a little bit quicker than at the federal level, which is also appealing from PhD projects where you work 5 years and, you know, get a paper or whatever. Having deadlines and things that are more of a, you know, week or month or maybe a year or two timeline rather than 5 years is really nice.
Mariah, I love this image of you in the dorm room trying to figure things out. I hate to break it to those of you panelists, but we can't use the dorms anymore. And so this year's SOtL program for the first time is going to be in a hotel. I don't think it's a real plush hotel. It's a pretty nice hotel. I guarantee it is better than the dorms that all of you had to suffer through.
I take that as a personal offense. I hope you know that.
Okay, so I'm curious, maybe not the first day, but your sort of first week there. What is this like? So you've just all spent, what, 4 to 5 years in a lab talking almost only to other scientists. And then I'm assuming you've bought your suit, you're there on the first day, you're dressed nice, and it's like this alien encounter. There are, I mean, I certainly know in the state of Arizona, there's lots and lots of elected officials that don't even have a college education. And all of a sudden you're coming face to face with somebody from a totally different world, and yet your job is to help them make better decisions to make the world a better place. So what does that interaction look like both at the beginning and as you sort of build out a relationship over time?
I mean, I think 2 things come to mind for me. First is acronym soup. Like my first day was just like, oh, people are talking a different language here. Like there's a lot of jargon that's new. I don't know what any of these acronyms mean. Oh boy. So it's a little bit overwhelming, but kind of related to that, I think it's really important and useful to, when you're entering that space, to come in with like, hey, I'm new here. I'm here to learn. I bring some unique skills, but like, just because I'm a scientist doesn't mean I know the right answer to all these things. I might be able to help you sort through data a little bit better than your average staffer, but like, I don't know the 10-year history, well, the 100-year history of water politics in California, right? Like, this is all new to me. I need to learn it. And so be a little bit humble when you come in, knowing that other people have been working on these problems for a very long time, and there's a lot of history that you're walking into. I think can help temper that if you kind of lead with that, and then being able to say like, I'm here to learn, but also maybe I can offer some new information to you based on my own experience.
For me, a big challenge was getting to know all of the processes involved. As government agency, we of course can't speak out ahead of what the commissioners who actually hold the power would wish to do. And every decision that we would want to make has to go through multiple stages of review, both legal and political, to ensure that it's what exactly the agency as a whole and what the commissioners are wanting to order on and approve. So working with all the different team members in both inside and outside the agency and our division are a key step. It's very different from it really just being myself and my advisor in graduate school, but having a team that we're all working together on some of the same items and interacting with each of those levels to ensure that everything is meeting the proper standards. Providing the scientific input is only one part of that.
Yeah, I think to maybe a little more piggyback off what Jacob was saying, I think what shocks a lot of scientists entering this kind of field for the first time is the lack of citations. You're just so used to proving your knowledge and being able to connect people back to the source should they want to dig more deeply into it. But that's not really the name of the game in kind of the policy world for a lot of teams. You want to find the most effective way to deliver the message with the least amount of words as possible, with the most accurate amount of depth that someone would need to make a choice. And the struggle in doing a lot of that is a lot of the information you want is not Googleable. So you do need to rely on a lot of these personal connections, somebody to walk you through the history of something. And even if the data exists, it maybe exists in an agency, and the ability to get that information and understand what happened to curate that information and validate it is not something that is always available to the legislature so quickly. So yeah, coming from a science world where anything kind of reputable isn't, at least in Google Scholar, hopefully, that is not the case anymore.
The first thing I noticed walked in was how pretty it was, right? We don't get as cool as buildings in the lab as we do in the state legislature. But on a more substantive note, when you are so specialized, I am so specialized, everyone on this call was so specialized, and non-scientists, so the worst person I worked for did not have a college education, see scientists as all science. So I studied peroxide chemistry. But you clearly know about digital ledger technology, right? Like that's something you know about. Or what's a reasonable number of storage hours for the state of Nebraska? So I think that having to understand your convey what your limitations are, but at the same time, you do have these skills that are not obtainable anywhere else other than a PhD program. This concept of research in the broadest context, so not adding t-butyllithium to a reaction, but understanding what are viable sources, being able to aggregate content across many platforms, and as Stephanie was saying, going to the right people to get information from them. These are all research techniques, and we're trained to be able to do that. And yeah, but we also had a mosaic of all of the geologic history of the state of Nebraska on our floor. So that was pretty cool too. Big notice that.
All right, so I used to explain the parody of what science outside the lab was. And the parody was that we'd have students that would come thinking, you know, if there was just 1 or 2 PhD scientists in Washington, D.C., government would make so much better decisions. You are all well understand at this point that the situation is a lot more complex to that. But I think for a lot of us it still seems that way. Like, man, if they just listened to scientists, wouldn't the policymakers do such a better job? Can you each sort of comment on how the people you work with do take science into account, and perhaps also maybe some of the other forces and tensions that draw them, that direct them in their policymaking as well? The complexity of science in the decision-making process.
I'd say our agency's leadership is very interested in the science. They are all very excited to have me and the other science fellows on board to help provide our past expertise and ability to conduct research and relay that information. That what we can provide to them is very, very helpful and works well in making decisions. But it's still only one part of the whole process, that there are always financial and political concerns when making decisions, and that we also consult with other agencies that may also have relevant scientific expertise regarding what we're working on, for example, siting of solar systems. So it is all very, very much taken into account, and it's not something that they take lightly in terms of the real world impacts and scientific bases for making these decisions, and that they are not using, I would not say that they're overriding these issues with more political concerns, but it is a multifactorial process.
In the Nebraska office, which is not as active as California, we are a part-time legislature. They are not in session all year. So I was in a very, very small office. There was one LA or legislative aide and one administrative aide in the whole office. And the senator I worked for was an incredibly humble person. She let me write an entire bill on my own related to green energy. So at that point, she gave me complete authority to use what I would consider viable science to write it. So she trusted me to do that. The bill never even was submitted because we realized it was too heavy a lift in the political environment that was Nebraska. So I would say that it was realistic in a realistic representation of, they will listen, but at the end of the day, there are things to consider beyond technical capabilities or goals.
Yeah, my experience with legislators and staffers and everyone is they all love science. The more science they can get, the better. They want a study that says my bill is the best idea ever. If they can find that, they are over the moon. Problem is, a lot of the times the questions that you're trying to figure out or the problems you're trying to solve in government don't have solid research behind them. And so a lot of the times you're left going to the legislator and being like, sorry, there is no data. I would love it if there was, but science cannot provide an answer here. I can't tell you what the impact of this policy change will be because no one's tried it before. It's a new idea, or maybe people have tried it, but we just don't have enough money to do the research to look into it, or people haven't asked that type of question before. And the other thing is, like, a lot of the times research that does exist isn't necessarily super generalizable to the question of policy making, right? You might be able to say like, oh yeah, this one study showed that in this one controlled environment, this is true, but what happens when we apply it to the entire state? I don't know, guess we'll find out. So, you know, I think one area where that becomes very useful in that kind of scientific background is, at least in California, it's very common for, if we're trying out a new idea, to put some sort of trial run, right? To develop a pilot project that has some sort of reporting mechanism. And so being a scientist and knowing like, okay, what questions are important? What data do we need in order to accurately assess this concern the legislators have? That can be very valuable when you're constructing that type of policy.
Yeah, and I think working kind of in the legislature, some of the bills we work on don't always specify an exact number or goal a lot of times, because that is flexibility that we like to leave up for the people who are actually doing like the implementing and the regulating, because they have more of the data, they understand what's going to be impactful, and a lot of times that target should move based on any number of considerations. So sometimes you need to install that kind of flexibility, but so far there certainly have been examples this year in the committee of like science being involved in legislation, like how many acres of kelp forests should we restore, how fast should boats go in order to prevent whale strikes, how do we best protect Joshua trees that are in an area of high priority for development. And I didn't analyze these bills for the record, but like science can guide a lot of that. And we as scientists can't get too sticky about exact numbers a lot of times, because like we don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. And those bills like very clearly involve science and data of some kind. But there also is this really complicated idea of trying to quantify and get data for societal impact. And so kind of thinking about how you're going to have impact on like disadvantaged communities is data that's also really hard to get. So we're not just analyzing information with a scientific lens anymore. Like there's so much additional stuff that we need to consider that should still be considered science and is lacking a lot of data, which makes it difficult.
All right, so the questions are starting to pour in from our participants. So I'm going to do one right now. I don't know, can you all see these? I'm not sure you can. But we are going to have Mark Kazur asks, what helped you prepare for your legislative experiences or government experiences? What helped you prepare the most when you were in graduate school?
For me, I'd say two things, but first, union organizing. Having experience working in a political space, advocating for a policy, seeing the non-science side of policy, right? The politics of why decisions get made, who they get made by, how you can apply pressure, that sort of thing. Super valuable information to have, even though like currently my job, right, I don't do any advocacy, I'm just an advisor. But knowing those different pressures is very helpful when I'm trying to advise legislators, because I understand the different pressures and values that they're considering in those decisions, and having that background is very helpful. And then the other thing is science communication, knowing how to communicate complicated information to people who don't have any background in science. That is fundamental to the science policy world. So that's the number one thing to practice.
It was helpful for me. I attended 3 lobby days at the state legislature during grad school, and and each one of them was on a different topic. And so that was a great experience to go there and be able to talk to legislators about what we were interested in, hear from them or the legislative assistants what questions they had and how they make those decisions and what they're interested in. that was very helpful in seeing those perspectives better for what they might be looking for and how to prioritize what types of bills that they would be working on. We also, I was also involved in a white paper project with our student government, and that was a great opportunity to work with a partner to do a research on a science energy related topic to prepare a briefing on what a upcoming legislative topic might be.
And I would echo being able to do some kind of science communication and outreach was really super helpful. Being able to figure out how to write for a broader audience and still being interesting, because scientists, I think a lot of times just write or present to report their findings instead of with the mission to teach. And a lot of times in this area, you are teaching simultaneously as you're giving a recommendation. So figuring out how to toe that line also in a way that is respectful, because these are elected officials. And despite you having the advanced degree and being in a teaching position, you are still, like, they are still your boss, and your job is to help them make the best decision possible. So yeah, that dynamic's a little different. And I think, yeah, outreach was a great thing for learning how to like strategize that information and figuring out how to hit the highlights, bottom line, up top or up front, I think is the thing. The analytical skills are of course super helpful that I learned from my PhD. I think the big difference is that kind of in your PhD, you're encouraged to just ask question after question after question. And at some point that needs to stop now in this world. You need to be like, enough research, we have to make a choice, and based on the available information that came in this amount of time, this is where we're leading to go.
My legislative experience was an internship when I was in grad school. So that was the most important thing I did in grad school. I did not prepare for that. I just signed up and tried really hard. But the skills that you can develop in grad school that I saw what that did translate into that experience is, again, the concept of being able to talk and science communication. But I also think there's another part of it, which is being able to convey an argument and being persuasive. Sometimes that gets you into trouble during your qualifying exams when you're in graduate school. However, I do recommend developing that skill. And then also writing. I cannot tell you the last time I read a paper or even a report. I read the executive summary and then I skim for information pulled from that executive summary that I need. So if you cannot write succinctly, my recommendation would be to practice that skill.
Yep, learning how to write is always near the top of the skills you need to make the transfer from graduate student to policymaker. All right, we have another question. This one is coming from Lauren Blake. Lauren wants to know, can you give an example of specific research projects that happen in a policy role and how this research differs from lab research?
Research and policy goes much faster. You're not looking at a long period of iterating one experiment after another, waiting to get results. It is basically reaching out to connections or looking for results online and being able to compile the information that you glean from that. It is typically maybe a one week turnaround or shorter, to be able to gather more like individual data points or a briefer memo. This is not research that is coming up with a very long paper necessarily. There are policy areas that are writing much longer papers, but in government especially, those are going to be shorter and to the point, with less detail, because the people who are making the decisions really want to only know what the key takeaways are going to be.
Well, so first of all, hi, Lauren. We went to high school together. The biggest difference for me is that I stopped using primary literature. I use secondary sources, reports. Rarely, if I looking for the what oxidation state of molybdenum was the best for this type of material to advance to do this goal, right? It was a lot more of the taking analysis and applying it to the topic at hand. So I especially use this in my job at the think tank, where the Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office are my two favorite people, because they gave me information I wanted. They were no one else's favorite people, but they were my favorite people.
So yeah, I've only been working in the legislature for a few months now, so I haven't had the experience to dig super deep in yet. There have been a couple of projects that I've been interested in researching, like what is the inequity in flood infrastructure? Why in the California code are burros not considered mammals? Like just these kind of like fun questions, and they're very different than the questions I would have asked in research. The difference now is that we have access to people whose job it is to actually do a lot of that research. So we have the California Research Bureau, which is great. We have a legislative analyst office. We have a lot of these people who their job is to help support the decision makers, and then kind of by proxy, also me as a role as a consultant in a policy committee. So it's actually been very fun to have these kinds of collaborations with other people who are actually more in this research role than I am.
Yeah, I'd say the answer, as it so often is in science policies, it depends. It depends on what your job is. It depends on the day and the type of project you're doing. Like Stephanie was saying, as a consultant in a policy committee in the legislature, most of your projects are on shorter turnarounds. I've had, an afternoon to write up talking points on an idea. I've had a weekend to analyze a big bill package that was going to have really big impacts and was going to be passed in 2 weeks. And I've had, a month or two to work on a single bill as I was working on other things. That being said, the sources I was drawing from oftentimes are these larger reports like what Moira was talking about, and those might have been compiled by people at agencies or think tanks or other groups that have been working on those specific projects and documents for months or years in some cases. And so it depends on what your job is and what your deadlines are.
All right, we have a question from Parker Lamascus, wants to get into some more the gritty details here. What are the pay and benefits like in science policy, and is that situation stable across elections and administrations? Tricky second part there. Who wants to field that?
Once again, it depends is the answer. Generally speaking, pay and benefits are good to decent. Like it once again depends where you're at, but and like if you're in advocacy, if you're in lobbying, who are you lobbying for? That might make a difference in what your pay and benefits are. If you're in the state government, are you, generally those benefits are pretty good, but the pay might not be quite as good, especially compared to the private sector. In general, the private sector, you can always make more money. That's true in science, that's true in government work. As for stability, if you are working for an individual politician, then you're probably not going to have a super stable position because your position depends on that politician being reelected. But there are a lot of positions in the science policy sphere that are not tied to a specific elected official, and those are much more stable.
I don't have much else to add. I'd say that my job, now that I've been hired full-time, is considered a classified position, which makes me part of the civil service. And so if the next governor's election, the results are different and a new administration wants to change what happens in our agency, it would not be very easy to get rid of me as a part of the civil service. But there are other positions called unclassified that don't necessarily have those protections.
Yeah, I don't have much to add besides state employees. You can see their pay. So if you're interested and you wanted to go pop over to look at the California consultants and see how much they're getting paid, there's quite a range. And you can see kind of the difference between personal office pay and consulting in a policy committee, and even just like the length of years people have been there really drastically does change the pay over time.
And I was an intern, so I made an entirety of $0.
But the benefits, Mariah, the benefits.
I mean, it was an invaluable experience. I like where I am now. So thanks, Senator Blood.
All right. We have an anonymous attendee who has a question. What is your sense of the relative influence of, and they give 3 examples, science, society, and political pressures? And they're open if there's one missing in that. So decision makers, what's the percentage of influence for between science, society, and political pressures? Or are we missing something that we need to talk about?
This is amazing. This was actually almost identical to one of the interview questions I was asked for my last job, is what should policy be made on? Data, so science, will of the people, so society, and then the last one, instead of political pressure, was ethics. And I think the answer for the think tank was data and was science, because as Jacob mentioned, those are places that have a lot of time to think, the think tank, and process and do research. So it depends at what step in the life cycle of policy change you're making, right? You have to go from all the way from ideation to signature. And there's a lot of steps along the way. So if you are in the think tank space, yeah, it is just science, I would say. But I think it becomes a little bit more complicated as it moves. And since we have some better experts than I on what happens when it moves, I'll turn it over to them.
I'll say in an executive agency, we see science and society as having a much stronger relative influence, and we have the opinions of the commissioners who are taking into account the science and the data and the numbers that the staff are presenting to them would be highly important. But we are also seeing influences from the governor's office and from the legislature and from the public as we have to address our multiple competing needs. So looking at the science that we have to address climate change, but we also have to address society in terms of how our decisions have impacts on the industry in the state and on the ratepayers who may be paying for some of these issues. So it really does all fit together. But in the end, I feel like a lot of the decisions are very well reasoned in terms of weighing each of these interests and aren't necessarily disregarding any sort of scientific necessities.
Yeah, once again, it depends. So for different legislators and different members have different things that they prioritize and how they make their decisions. So each senator, each assembly member, it's different person to person. And ultimately they're the ones who got elected. So it's up to whatever they want to do and based on that. But that being said, to get a little bit more specificity on just like my personal thoughts, right? Generally speaking, elected legislators, their primary role, as I tend to think about it, is to represent the interests of the people they were elected by. And so that is going to be the number one thing driving all their decision. And then all these other factors get folded into that, right? You know, if you have a bill on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then an individual legislator is going to be thinking, okay, what does that do for the people I represent? And in order to make that decision, they need to know science, right? They need to know the effects of climate change, but they also need to know economics and business. They need to think about how jobs are going to be affected, and what communities might change and might benefit or be hurt by the technology we bring in to solve these problems. And so it's a very complicated and very values-heavy decision-making process. And science is an important input to that, but it's definitely not the only one. And I'd say generally, most members, although there might be some exceptions, for example, there was an assembly member for a while who had a PhD, Dr. Quirk. And so I think he might have been a little bit more on the science side of things. But generally speaking, the legislators are thinking, how are the people who elected me, how does this serve them?
Yeah, and I won't repeat anything that's been said. I think if anything could be added to that etc. portion, it would be what everything comes back to, which is money. All of these bills cost something. And so after they go through kind of their policy committee where we evaluate the idea, we evaluate kind of that societal pressure, the ethics of the question. It is a whole other committee's job to figure out, is this possible with the budget of the state this year? And those bills can be prioritized. So even if something is more costly and it's going to provide that at least that amount of benefit, then it should move forward. But if not, then it doesn't. So depending on how tight your budget is, you can do more or less things and maybe open the door even wider for some ideas.
All right, so the questions are coming fast and furious now. So let's see how many we can get to in the last 7 minutes. The next one I think we can do pretty quickly. How have you been able to create or maintain work-life balance? And for you, is it easier or harder than when you were a grad student?
Easier. Oh my God, so much easier. The legislature is not, I think, a normal workplace in terms of work-life balance. You might be working odd hours. I've had to work weekends. I've had to work long nights before. But the work structure is cyclical and based on a known calendar. And so you can plan around it, which is really nice. And there are actual deadlines. When you're done with work, you're done with work. And even with all that craziness of politics, it's still less time and pressure, I think, in some ways than a PhD.
In an executive agency, we are basically we're fairly consistent year round. I work 9 to 5, and I'm happy to check emails or work on something that I'm interested in at night, but there's really no expectation for that. Definitely easier than grad school.
All right, next question is from Caroline Greiner. What does the day-to-day look like in a science policy job? And in terms of activities you're doing, are you reading, are you writing, are you having meetings, broader cognitive activities like brainstorming, being creative, being analytical?
Yeah, I can jump in. So like Jacob was saying, kind of in the legislature, things are super cyclical. So it depends on the type of like month that we're in. When it is bill season and they're coming through, I am doing a lot of reading about the background of these bills. I am taking meetings from stakeholders who either have sponsored the bill or have some kind of investment, and they're trying to convince me that this is a good or bad idea for any reason. I'm trying to reach out to the agencies to get the information and data that could validate or pull this bill one way or another. When we are not in that kind of time, I'm spending a lot more time reading the news, trying to understand the landscape, dig into projects that are of interest to me. Right now, as I mentioned, I'm on a field trip, so there's opportunities to actually see stuff in person related to the work that I do, which is really fun. I mean, we didn't get to do this in grad school, to go out on these cool big field trips unless you did science outside the lab, which is kind of a novelty. So
all right, we'll go to the next question. This is from Faith Zablon. How vastly should one be knowledgeable on legislative policies, the policy processes, while supplementing it with your scientific knowledge and skills? Is it a learn on the job sort of experience?
You should know everything at all the time, right? But that is also impossible. You cannot know everything. Like, no, even if you've been the best LA, the chief of staff for infinite years, you will not know everything. However, you should take every opportunity to absorb, be a sponge as much as possible. I would say I learned a lot from being around people, listening carefully, asking to do tasks that were maybe outside of my technical job as a $0 intern. But I wouldn't recommend going in with not knowing that there are 3 branches of government, which I'm not saying that you don't know that, but that's a joke that Jamie likes to make about the level of knowledge some scientists have about at least federal government. There is a lot of opportunity to learn on the job. It's not something you've ever done before. At least it was not something I had ever done before. And people were gracious enough to help me out along the way.
Yeah, and to kind of maybe touch on FACE, and then I think, Caroline, I didn't fully answer your question in terms of like brainstorming and cognitive stuff. I think the bills come in as they are, and so the creativity is maybe not what you're thinking about when you think about like science, but when we see a problem, we do still need to kind of suggest solutions. And so that's where I think I find most of the time that I'm brainstorming with the other people in my office and trying to come up with creative solutions. Because like, we don't want to affect this, but we do need to affect this, and like how to like navigate those different issues. So I think, and which then touches on FACE, like my scientific knowledge, I don't think I'm like actively using so much as like being able to kind of hold a lot of different interests and difficulties in my mind at the same time and figuring out how to navigate in between them.
All right, we got one more quick question. We got 1 minute to answer it. So Walter Henderson wants to know, you're all just starting, but are you motivated to continue in this career, to keep moving up in the policy world? And the second question he wants to know is it important to have scientists in elected office? All right, each of you get 20 seconds, go.
No, being a lawmaker sounds terrible. Their jobs look very hard and would take years off my life.
I'd say that I enjoy the staff role, that I'm able to specialize in what I'm interested in. Thinking about the commissioners at our agency, they have a I guess a less direct connection with some of the issues that they're working on, and they rely on their aides and staff significantly, whereas they are focusing more on a broader swath of issues, and as well as some more communication and outreach issues. So that's not necessarily the position I would want to end up in. But I'd say the second question, yeah, more scientists I think are always great. We do have a scientist, a physicist professor in the state legislature here, and he really focuses on scientific issues, ensuring adequate funding, and addressing the challenges that our state faces.
Absolutely not. But you know what, Walter? Henderson 2040. I got you. $5.
I don't have interest in being in that kind of leadership role, but I do like to kind of support those people and help them. So that's kind of where my ambitions lie, to be parallel to those kinds of people. Scientists in elected office. I mean, sure, I think having a diversity of people with experience in these kinds of positions is necessary for well-rounded, well-thought-out legislation and goals. And ultimately, as Jacob was saying, like they are there to represent the people that they represent. So it depends on what you think the role of government, like their role is. And if they are actively promoting the goal of their district, like that is what they're there to do. And plenty of other people in this world can be scientists to help them make the best decisions possible, because their skill set is not necessarily the needed skill set of a scientist.
Sawyer, Mariah, Stephanie, Jacob, thank you so much for sharing and for taking time out of your busy careers, your busy lives. Really, really thank you for joining us, and I learned a lot. this officially conclude, well, David, you were going to do official conclusion probably?
You can certainly do it, but go, yeah, so go ahead. I'll let you.
So I'll do the preliminary official conclusion, and then David always, for some reason, has some last words. So we are going to officially adjourn. There's a few people that are in the participants right now that are going to be departing within the next week for Science Outside the Lab, for their first experience of Science Outside the Lab. Those people, we would welcome you to stay and ask questions directly of our panelists about their experiences in Science Outside the Lab. So feel free to hang out. Everyone else, David, you have some official last words, or tell us when the next seminar is?
Yeah, just again, thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for a really stimulating, interesting discussion. As I mentioned at the start, we are going to be taking a summer break. So our next webinar will be in August. I don't have the exact date. Again, check out the NNCI events page for the latest information. And with that, I will stop the recording. And then again, as Jamie